The job was a grueling ballet of forced cheer, a game of calculated smiles and aching arches. But for Suddy Boyd, every shift was a raw, desperate fight for survival. When the man in the charcoal suit walked through the door, a phantom of high finance wearing a platinum watch that probably cost more than her combined future earnings, she permitted herself a flicker of dangerous hope. He ran up a $400 tab on expensive, off-menu items, consumed it all in unnerving silence, and then simply vanished. Suddy raced to clear the booth, her heart hammering a frantic, stupid rhythm, praying this was the night she could finally cover the overdue rent. Instead, 2 disgustingly crumpled dollar bills lay on the otherwise spotless melamine. It was a calculated, deliberate slap in the face. Fury surged, scalding her throat. She was ready to chase him into the Seattle deluge. But as her fingers swept the remnants of the meal, they snagged on something alien, stiffly taped to the underside of the heavy ceramic plate. It wasn't a mere tip or a casual note. It was a cold, concise warning. A sentence that instantly forced her from exhaustion into a desperate, terrified scramble for her life. This is the story of that insulting $2 tip, the one that bought a war. The relentless Seattle rain never washed anything clean. It only lubricated the city's inherent grime, turning its surfaces slick and treacherous. It was 9:45 p.m. On a desolate Tuesday, the kind of night where the failing neon sign of Jerry's Diner didn't just buzz. It shrieked with the tortured sound of a trapped, dying insect. Inside, the stagnant air was a suffocating blend of scorched coffee grounds and ancient fryer grease. A stench so deeply ingrained it had become part of Suddy Boyd's worn, gray cardigan. Suddy mechanically swabbed counter number 4 for the 20th time, her knuckles raw, red, and chafed. At 26, she carried the heavy, skeletal exhaustion typically reserved for someone twice her age. The harsh digital clock on the wall mocked her steady, downward spiral. 15 minutes until closing time. 15 minutes until the relief of heading back to her cramped, subsidized studio apartment, where she would count the miserable trickle of her earnings and face the devastating realization that she was still $80 short on rent. The rusted bell above the door gave a tired, mournful chime, slicing through the pounding rain outside. Suddy sighed, dropping her soaked rag back into the overly chlorinated sanitizer bucket. "We close in 15, she called out automatically, not bothering to lift her gaze. "I eat fast." The voice was a deep, resonant baritone, instantly commanding the confined space. Suddy looked up. The man silhouetted in the doorway was a profound anomaly. Jerry's Diner catered to exhausted long-haul truckers, overworked hospital staff, and bleary-eyed college kids trying to nurse away last night's tequila. It was not a setting for a specimen like this. He was intimidatingly tall, encased in a charcoal wool coat that looked custom-made to repel water, like polished obsidian shedding oil. Beneath it, a tailored suit, likely Italian wool, fit him with an unnerving, almost military precision. His hair was silver fox, immaculately swept back, and his eyes were an arctic, unsettling shade of piercing gray. He looked like he had just abandoned a hostile corporate boardroom merger or perhaps stepped directly out of a high-profile, somber funeral. "Booth in the back," Suddy instructed, automatically snatching a laminated menu. "Coffee black and the steak rare." He moved past her, his expensive cologne, a heady mix of sandalwood and fine tobacco, ruthlessly overpowering the diner's institutional odor of old grease. He selected the darkest corner, positioning himself with his back cemented to the wall, his intense gaze methodically sweeping all the exits. Suddy poured the coffee, her hand shaking barely perceptibly. She knew him, or she thought she did. Not from the neighborhood, but from the discarded newspapers left on the tables by the morning commuters. Austin Pembroke, the notorious real estate tycoon. The man who was currently in the process of systematically acquiring and tearing down half the city's historic waterfront. Why was a man worth billions consuming a cheap, $20 steak in a decaying hole like this? She served him with perfect, mechanical efficiency. She did not linger. Rich people hated the sensation of being watched. She refilled his coffee before the liquid dropped below the halfway mark. She brought extra heavy-duty napkins. She was flawless, Inside her skull, the feverish math began. If he's a billionaire, a 20% tip is meaningless pocket dust. Maybe he drops 100, maybe 500. I could make the rent. I could finally buy Leo's specialized asthma medication. Hope was a corrosive, dangerous thing. It made her forced smile momentarily genuine. Is everything to your liking, sir? She asked quietly as he took the final bite. Pembroke looked at her. Truly looked at her. His piercing gaze paused on her stitched name tag, then drifted to the cheap silver locket resting against her collarbone, which held the blurry, fading photograph of her late father. You're Thomas's daughter, he stated flatly. It wasn't a question requesting confirmation. Suddy froze, the heavy glass coffee pot suspended precariously in midair. Excuse me? You have his eyes. Sad eyes. Pembroke deliberately wiped his mouth with the napkin, dropping it cleanly onto the plate. Check, please. He offered zero explanation. He refused to elaborate. Suddy's heart began to hammer violently against her ribs. Her father, Thomas, had been killed in a horrific factory accident 6 years prior. A closed casket tragedy that had bequeathed her and her younger brother, Leo, nothing but crushing debt and endless grief. How could this remote, untouchable billionaire possibly know a dead factory foreman? She mechanically printed the check, $42. She placed the slip carefully on the table. Pembroke produced a crisp $50 bill from a thin leather money clip. Keep the change, she murmured, her voice laced with involuntary hope, trembling slightly. No, Pembroke said, his tone razor-sharp and cold. Bring me my change. Suddy felt the hot, ugly flush of humiliation surge up her neck and face. She walked back to the register, broke the 50, and returned with $7. Pembroke stood up, meticulously buttoning his massive coat. He collected the $5 bill and the handful of quarters. Then, deliberately, he placed 2 individual single-dollar bills on the table. $2. On a $40 meal. From a man worth untold billions. He walked straight out into the sheeting rain without a single backward glance. Suddy stared at the 2 shamefully crumpled bills. The rage was immediate, scalding, and overwhelming. It wasn't merely cheap. It was a profound act of cruelty. It was a clear, insulting message. You are worth nothing. Hot, angry tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She grabbed the plate, intending to violently hurl it into the industrial bus tub in the back. Jerk, she hissed under her breath. As she tilted the heavy plate to scrape the meager leftovers into the steel bin, she finally saw it. It wasn't just a leftover napkin under the china. Taped firmly to the bottom of the heavy ceramic, carefully protected from the grease and crumbs, was a small, tightly folded piece of thick, cream-colored stationery. Taped right next to it was a small, antique brass key. She scanned the deserted diner. The night cook, Old Man Miller, was predictably out back, puffing on his usual cigarette. The dining room was totally empty. Suddy peeled the note quickly off the china. Her hands were trembling so violently she nearly dropped the key. She smoothed the paper open. The handwriting was jagged, clearly rushed, penned by someone under extreme duress. The $2 is for the cameras. They are watching you. They know who you are. Your father's accident wasn't an accident. Go to Union Station Locker 402 tonight. Trust no one, especially not the police. Suddy looked toward the glass door where Pembroke had moments ago disappeared. The flashing, erratic lights of a passing municipal car momentarily illuminated the windows. For a terrifying second, she thought she saw a large, black SUV idling silently across the street, its headlights deliberately turned off. She was no longer just a tired waitress. She was a marked target. Suddy didn't even bother to clock out. She ripped her apron off and threw it haphazardly into the hamper, grabbed her coat, and bolted out the back door into the narrow, slick alleyway. The rain was torrential now, instantly saturating her clothes, but the cold dread coiling in her stomach was far colder than the water. Your father's accident wasn't an accident. The terrible phrase cycled in her mind like a corrupted, broken audio loop. Thomas Boyd had supposedly fallen into a massive meshing machine at the Vanguard Textiles plant. The corporation had immediately labeled it gross negligence on his part. They had denied the pension. They had denied the insurance payout. Suddy, barely 20 at the time, had been left solely responsible for raising her 10-year-old brother, Leo, on absolutely zero reserves. Keeping her head down, she moved swiftly through the deep shadows of the alley. She ruled out the bus immediately. Pembroke's note specifically warned. They were watching. But who were they? 3 blocks away, she flagged down a battered taxi, using the crumpled cash tips she jammed into her pocket. Union Station, she told the driver, constantly checking the side mirrors and the rear window every few seconds, expecting to see the black SUV materialize behind them. The station was a vast, echoing chamber at this late hour, amplifying every sound. A few homeless figures slept huddled on benches, and a janitor pushed a mop in slow, disinterested circles. Suddy gripped the brass key in her pocket so tightly the ridges cut painfully into her palm. Locker 402 was tucked away in the derelict old wing near the long-abandoned ticket booths, a forgotten bank of grim, gray metal boxes that reeked overwhelmingly of rust and decay. She located 402. It had a noticeable dent near the bottom edge. She glanced furtively over her shoulder. A man in a standard-issue blue maintenance uniform was observing her from across the wide hall. He swiftly averted his gaze the instant she turned. Paranoia, or finely tuned survival instinct. She jammed the key into the tumbler. Turned with a crisp, immensely satisfying click. Inside, nestled deep within the cold metal box, was a worn leather satchel. It was old, deeply scuffed, and smelled exactly like pipe tobacco. The same comforting scent she remembered vividly from her father's enveloping hugs. She pulled it out, her breath hitching painfully. It was remarkably heavy. She knew instantly she couldn't risk opening it in the open concourse. She was too exposed. Clamping the bag tightly to her chest, she power-walked toward the women's restroom. She locked herself into the furthest stall, sinking onto the closed toilet lid, her wet shoes squeaking softly on the ceramic tile. With severely trembling fingers, she unbuckled the straps. Inside were 3 primary items. 1. A thick stack of crisp $100 bills, bound tightly with rubber bands. It looked conservatively like $10,000. 2. A heavy, black leather-bound notebook. 3. A single, grainy photograph. She picked up the photograph first. It was slightly blurry, taken clearly from a significant distance. It showed 2 men in a heated argument on a murky dock. One was her father, Thomas, looking livid, finger aggressively pointing. The other man, Suddy gasped, a cold knot forming in her throat, was younger than, but unmistakably Charles Vane, the current CEO of Vanguard Textiles, the very man who had personally signed off on denying her family's insurance claim. Standing slightly behind Vane, looking down and away from the confrontation, was Austin Pembroke. She opened the thick black notebook. It wasn't a personal journal. It was a precise, meticulously kept ledger. Columns of staggering numbers, dates, and complex chemical formulas filled the pages. On the very first page, written in her father's familiar, looping handwriting, were the horrifying words, Project Chimera. They are dumping the runoff directly into the city reservoir. The cancer rates in Sector 4 aren't a tragic coincidence. Vane knows everything. Pembroke is funding the cover-up. If I die, this is the proof. Suddy felt the blood drain entirely from her face, leaving her icy. Sector 4 was the rundown neighborhood where she and Leo had been raised. It was the same neighborhood where her mother had succumbed to leukemia just 3 years before her father's supposed accident. It hadn't been an accident at all. It was murder, cold and calculated. And Pembroke, the billionaire who had just left her a $2 tip and a secret key, was listed explicitly as a conspirator. Why had he given her this now? Why the huge stack of cash? She frantically flipped through the pages. Tucked deep within the center was yet another note, written on the identical cream-colored stationery as the first. I couldn't save him. I was a coward then. Vane has hired a cleaner to find all the loose ends. You are the last loose end. The money is to grab your brother and run. But if you want justice, don't run. Check the news tomorrow morning. I'm sorry. Check the news. Suddy pulled out her old, cracked smartphone. Her wet thumbs slipped on the screen as she frantically refreshed the local news feed. Asterisk breaking news. Billionaire Austin Pembroke found dead in apparent suicide. Body discovered in luxury vehicle outside Lino's brasserie. Suddy nearly dropped the phone into the toilet water. The timeline was impossible. He had just left the diner maybe 20 minutes ago. And Lino's brasserie? That was clear across town, miles from Jerry's diner. She reread the alert, zooming in on the accompanying photo of the vehicle. It was the large, black SUV she had seen idling outside the diner. They had killed him. They had executed Pembroke mere minutes after he left her. They were likely waiting for him, expecting him to lead them to the ledger. But Pembroke hadn't had the ledger. She did. A heavy, resounding slam echoed throughout the otherwise silent restroom. The main door had been kicked open. She came in here, a man's voice grunted. Deep, gravelly, and instantly terrifying. It wasn't the maintenance worker. Check the stalls. Suddy instantly pulled her feet up onto the slick toilet seat, clutching the satchel to her chest. Her heart hammered so violently she was certain the sound alone would give her away. She heard the slow, deliberate rhythm of heavy boots crossing the tile floor. Thud, thud. They stopped directly outside the first stall. Bang! The door was violently kicked inward. Empty. The boots moved to the second stall. Bang! Suddy was in the fourth. She looked around desperately. No window, no ventilation shaft large enough for escape. Come out, little girl. The voice sneered, now much closer. We know you have Thomas's book. Give it to us and maybe you get to see your brother again. Leo. The direct, icy threat against Leo instantly flipped a critical switch in Suddy's brain. Fear vanished entirely, replaced by the cold, razor-sharp resolve of a protective mother. A role she had been forced to inhabit for far too long. She plunged her hand into her purse. No gun. But she had a can of pepper spray she carried religiously for her late-night bus routes and the jagged, heavy piece of metal, the locker key. She was still clenching. The boots stopped precisely in front of her stall door. Suddy braced herself against the back wall. As the lock mechanism began to turn from the outside, clearly being picked or forced, she prepared to fight for her life in that small, damp space. The flimsy lock on the stall door snapped with a loud, tinny pop. As the door began to swing inward, Suddy didn't hesitate. She didn't scream. She exploded into immediate, violent motion. The man was enormous. A solid wall of muscle stuffed into a cheap leather jacket, but he expected a cowering, hysterical girl. He didn't anticipate a powerful, focused blast of concentrated pepper spray aimed directly into his open eyes. Arg! The man roared, stumbling wildly back, his hands clawing uselessly at his burning face. Suddy didn't stop. She lowered her shoulder and rammed him. Not powerfully enough to knock him out, but enough to severely unbalance him on the wet tile floor. He slipped, his massive head cracking against the porcelain sink with a sickening, wet thud. She bolted. She burst out of the restroom and into the main terminal concourse. The maintenance worker she'd seen earlier was now speaking urgently into a walkie-talkie, his eyes immediately locking onto her. Target is moving main concourse, he shouted. Suddy realized with chilling clarity she wasn't dealing with common street thugs. She was facing a highly organized private army. She sprinted toward the south exit, her lungs burning raw. She could hear frantic shouting behind her. She burst through the double doors and into the unforgiving downpour. A line of yellow taxis idled by the curb. She ripped the back door of the first one open. Drive! She screamed at the bewildered driver. Just drive. Whoa, lady, where to? Anywhere. Just go. She snatched $100 bill from the cash stack and threw it onto the front seat. The driver saw the money and floored the gas pedal instantly. The taxi screeched away from the curb just as the maintenance worker and another man in a tailored suit burst through the station doors. Suddy slid down low in the seat, clutching the leather satchel like a lifeline. She was safe for the immediate moment, but she now faced an insurmountable problem. They had mentioned Leo. Asterisk, maybe you get to see your brother again. Asterisk, if they knew who she was, they knew where she lived. They knew about her kind, elderly babysitter, Mrs. Gable. Change of plans, Suddy said, her voice shaking uncontrollably. I need to go to 4th and Elm. Fast. Asterisk, please let me be in time. Asterisk, the taxi wove erratically through the rainy, choked streets. Suddy pulled out the ledger again, needing desperately to comprehend the deadly information she was holding. Why had Pembroke died for this? She flipped toward the back pages. There were cryptic bank account numbers, Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and a meticulously detailed list of names under the heading payroll. Judges, key city council members, even a police captain. This wasn't merely about environmental pollution. This was about a powerful criminal empire built on systematically poisoning an entire city to save money on industrial waste disposal. Charles Vane had saved millions of dollars by dumping carcinogens directly into the public water table, and he had successfully paid off the entire city apparatus to look the other way. Suddy's cheap phone buzzed violently. Unknown number. She shouldn't answer. In every movie she'd ever seen, you never answered. But she pressed accept. Hello? You're a hard woman to catch, Suddy. A smooth, cultured voice said. It sounded like velvet wrapped tightly around a hidden razor blade. Who is this? I'm the man cleaning up Mr. Pembroke's mess. My name is Mr. Silas. Wait, no, names aren't necessary. Let's make a deal. The book for the boy. Suddy's blood instantly ran ice cold. If you touch him, I haven't touched him yet. Mrs. Gable is a very sweet old lady. She's making tea right now. We are sitting in your living room, Suddy. It's quite small. Cozy. I'm calling the police, Suddy lied, tasting ash in her mouth. Go ahead. Captain Miller is listed on page 45 of the book you're currently holding. Who do you think he'll send to arrest me? Suddy snatched the ledger open. Page 45. There it was, Captain D. Miller. $5,000 monthly stipend. She was utterly trapped. What do you want? She whispered into the phone. Bring the book to the old steel mill on the river. The one where your father had his accident. Fitting, don't you think? Come alone. 1 hour. Or Mrs. Gable runs out of tea. The line went dead. Suddy looked out the window. They were 2 blocks from her dilapidated apartment building. She could see her building. There was a black sedan, not the SUV but close enough, parked conspicuously in the fire lane. Stop! She screamed at the driver. It's pouring, lady. Stop! The taxi braked violently. She threw open the door. She couldn't go in there. If she walked into the apartment, they would kill her and Leo immediately. They wanted the book. As long as she held the book, she retained the only leverage she possessed. But she desperately needed backup. She couldn't call the corrupted police. She couldn't risk the slow, cautious media. Leo had less than an hour. She stood paralyzed in the pouring rain, the water matting her hair to her face. She looked at the satchel. Pembroke had provided money and evidence, but he had left one final, crucial message in the note. Trust no one. Wait, she replayed the key sentence in her mind. Trust no one, especially not the police. But there was a name in the ledger she had seen earlier. A name that had a heavy line drawn through it, and the word refused written next to it in stark red ink. Jack Thorne, investigative journalist. If Vane's operation had tried to bribe him and he had rejected them, perhaps he was the single ally she had left in this entire poisoned city. She Googled the name Jack Thorne. The results flashed. Asterisk disgraced reporter, fired from the Tribune for promoting unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. Asterisk he now ran a pathetic blog. He lived above a pawn shop on the south side. Suddy checked her watch. 50 minutes left. She jumped back into the taxi. Take me to South Holstead. And hurry. A kid's life depends on it. As the taxi accelerated, Suddy opened the satchel and pulled out the massive stack of cash. She was no longer a waitress fighting for tips. Tonight, she was a woman at war. She began frantically formulating a plan. She wouldn't simply hand over the book. She was going to use this information to burn Charles Vane's toxic empire to the ground, or she would die in the attempt. But first, She had to recruit a disgraced journalist who probably reeked of cheap whiskey and eternal regret. South Holstead Street smelled of damp concrete, stale fried food, and crushing desperation. The neon sign of Gold Star Pawn flickered with a violent, seizure-inducing strobe effect. Suddy paid the cab driver, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from sheer adrenaline overdose. 38 minutes remained. She found the side door, its peeling paint announcing a miserable existence. Jack Thorne lived in 2B. She didn't bother with the buzzer. She hammered on the door with frantic, powerful blows until her fist was aching. Minutes passed, precious, wasted minutes. Finally, a voice bellowed from the crude intercom system, thick with sleep and profound irritation. "Whoever you are, I don't have any money, and I already subscribe to Watchtower. Jack Thorne, my name is Suddy Boyd, Thomas Boyd's daughter. Open the door right now, or I swear I will kick it in." Silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. Then the buzzer gave a harsh, metallic scream. Suddy took the stairs 2 at a time. Apartment 2B was unlocked. She burst inside. The apartment was not a home. It was a claustrophobic shrine to paranoid conspiracy and total neglect. Newspapers were stacked in unstable towers that reached the ceiling beams. Empty takeout containers formed small, pungent civilizations on the sticky coffee table. Jack Thorne stood in the middle of the mess, wearing wrinkled boxers and a faded, beer-stained t-shirt, holding a heavy wooden baseball bat. He looked like a man who had gone 12 exhaustive rounds with life and lost every single one of them. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw covered in 3 days of graying, scratchy stubble. "Boyd," Thorne grunted, lowering the bat fractionally. "The textile foreman. 6 years ago. The accident." "It wasn't an accident," Suddy confirmed, her voice tight and ringing with forced control. She marched past him into the tiny kitchen, dropping the heavy leather satchel onto a table buried under empty beer cans. "And you know it. That's why they professionally blacklisted you." Thorne let out a short, bitter laugh, rubbing his weary face. "Look, kid, I tried to poke the bear. The bear swiped back, got me blacklisted from every reputable news outlet in the entire country. And now I write pathetic blog posts about UFOs for pocket change. Go home. Vane won." Vane didn't win. Not yet. Suddy ripped open the satchel. She ignored the stack of cash. Thorne didn't look like a man who was motivated by money anymore. She pulled out the black ledger. She slammed it down onto the table, knocking over a half-full beer can that foamed sickly onto the linoleum floor. "Austin Pembroke gave me this 20 minutes before they murdered him tonight." Thorne instantly froze. The deep, ingrained apathy vanished from his bloodshot eyes. The soft blur was gone, replaced by a cutting, almost surgical intensity. Pembroke was gone, suicide, the headlines screamed. But murder, the cryptic note he'd left claimed. Suddy didn't dwell on the chemical schematics. She flipped past the dense calculations straight to the back section. The meticulously itemized ledger of corruption. She spun the heavy book on the desk. Thorne's gaze was drawn by an awful magnetism. His finger, steady now despite the years of neglect, traced down the damning columns, past the names of judges, past the high-ranking police captain who'd stonewalled his career. The world stopped when his own name materialized. Jack Thorne, investigative journalist. A tidy $50,000 offer. Refused. Note, too righteous. Destroy his credibility. Thorne didn't just stare. He inhaled the entry, his fists clenched, trembling with a fury long suppressed. This wasn't just proof. It was vindication etched in cold black ink. The whispers hadn't been real. The professional ruin wasn't deserved. He hadn't been a failed drunk. He had been a victim. He had been marked for destruction. "They executed my father to bury the truth about the sector for dumping," Suddy said, her voice flat, emptied of all previous softness. "They murdered Austin Pembroke because he finally found a conscience. And right this minute, Charles Vane's personal, bloodless fixer holds my little brother hostage at the old mill. He demanded this book within the hour." She checked her cheap watch, the ticking suddenly deafening. "I have 25 minutes remaining. The police are useless. Vane bought them years ago. I require an ally, someone whose hatred for Vane matches mine. Her eyes, now blazing with the same righteous inferno that had once consumed him, locked onto Thorn. Jack, make a choice. Are you going to help me stop him? Or are you just going to surrender to the bastards forever? The transformation was absolute. The slumped posture evaporated. The defeated drunkard vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, calculating newsman Suddy had needed. The Vanguard Mill, Thorn muttered, his mind already spinning tactical maneuvers. Smart. It's remote. The noise covers everything. A perfect setting for an ambush. He stalked toward a closet overflowing with forgotten clutter. He said he'd trade the boy for the book? He's lying, Suddy. Vane never leaves witnesses, only clean-up crews. You hand over that ledger, and both you and Leo will end up weighted down in the river. Suddy recoiled, a wave of nausea hitting her. Then what in God's name do we do? Thorn emerged, dragging a bulky, professional-grade digital camera and a robust audio recorder, tools of his forgotten trade. He swiftly checked the charge on the heavy battery packs. We hijacked the story, Thorn said, a grim line set across his jaw. You walk in there to make the exchange, just like he demanded. I'm taking the back entry. I spent a summer working that mill in college. I know the layout, the service tunnels, the high catwalks in the rafters. They won't look up. He handed her the camera. He won't kill you until he confirms the book is authentic. That validation buys us the time we need. Thorn declared, grabbing a thick, dirty jacket. We need two things, burner phones and a stop at a hardware store. If we're marching into a declared war zone, we need firepower. Suddy, having already shown him the thick wad of hundreds she'd emptied from her savings, didn't need to ask what kind of firepower. She simply bolted for the door, Thorn limping fast behind her. The long-abandoned campaign for justice, the crusade they both thought was dead, was now terrifyingly alive. The sprawling, hulking mass of the Vanguard steel mill dominated the city's industrial periphery, a colossal rotting carcass against the dismal sky. It had been shuttered for 10 years, ever since Vane moved operations overseas. Now it was a skeletal monument of rusted girders and jagged, broken glass, shrouded in the persistent cold drizzle. This was more than just a dumping ground. This was where Suddy's father had spent his life, where he had first spotted the illegal protocols. It was a cathedral of ghosts. Thorn parked his rattling sedan a quarter-mile down a slick service road, tucking it behind a massive mound of coal slag. The heavy rain had eased to a bone-chilling drizzle that coated the world in a greasy sheen. All right? Thorn breathed, checking the red recording light on his camera one final time. It blinked a silent promise in the gloom. I'm heading for the east ventilation stack. I'll be 40 feet up, directly over the floor. You need to get them talking. Force Silas to admit why Vane wants the book and make sure Vane's name leaves his lips. He pressed a small, cheap burner phone, their first purchase, into Suddy's hand. I'm programmed to speed dial 1. If things go completely sideways, hit the button. I'll initiate the distraction. What kind of distraction? Suddy asked, her gaze flicking toward the canvas bag of industrial supplies they just purchased at the all-night hardware store. The deafening kind, he replied. Just enough chaos to buy me the precious seconds I need to get into position. Thorn's hand settled heavily on her shoulder. A surprising, brief moment of solid comfort. You've got more grit than you show, Boyd. Your father would be immensely proud. He withdrew his hand. Now move. He dissolved into the protective darkness. Suddy took a seismic, steadying breath. The leather satchel clutched tight to her chest. It felt impossibly heavy now, weighed down not just by the ledger, but by the fate of her entire family. She walked the muddy length of the service road toward the gaping, cavernous entrance of the main smelting hangar. The silence within the valley was immense, shattered only by the metallic drip of residual rainwater and the heavy crunch of her own footsteps. Inside, the mill was a nightmare cavern of impenetrable shadows. Shafts of cold moonlight pierced the gaps in the collapsed roof, illuminating massive, dormant machinery that resembled sleeping, archaic dinosaurs. The smell of decades-old soot and cold, Oxidized metal was thick in the stale air. Centered in the colossal space, a single high-powered construction lamp sat atop an overturned crate, casting a harsh, theatrical cone of blinding white light. In the dead center of that illumination was a rickety wooden chair. Tied to it, his face pale and swollen, gagged by a strip of dark cloth, was Leo. His eyes were wide with pure terror, reddened from exhausted crying. Standing next to him, leaning with casual, disdainful ease against a rusting hydraulic press, was the man from the phone, Mr. Silas. He looked entirely out of place, wearing an expensive, tailored raincoat over a sharp suit, a figure of lethal precision in this industrial graveyard. He held a high-caliber silenced pistol hanging loosely at his side. "Punctual," Silas's voice echoed, oddly distorted and clinical in the massive emptiness. "I appreciate timeliness, Suddy. Step into the light, please. Let's verify the merchandise." Suddy's legs felt like lead weights as she moved forward, stopping exactly 10 feet away, just at the periphery of the light's harsh edge. "Leo," she choked out, the name catching in her throat. "Are you all right?" Leo nodded his head violently against the cloth gag, his desperation visible. "Let him go," Suddy demanded, holding up the worn leather satchel. "Let him walk out of here, then you get the book." Silas let out a dry, rasping chuckle, a sound like coarse sandpaper tearing wood. Suddy, you are in absolutely no position to dictate terms. You are currently trespassing on private property and are in possession of stolen corporate materials." He raised the pistol fractionally, its black maw now centered directly on Leo's kneecap. "The ledger, now, or the boy will never walk again." Suddy's breath hitched, a spasm of pure animal fear. She quickly flicked her eyes up toward the skeletal rafters, praying Thorn was in position, praying that red light was rolling. She had to buy time. She had to force the confession. "Why is this so vital?" she asked, her voice trembling, taking a slow, defiant step forward. "It's just an antiquated notebook. Why execute Austin Pembroke over it? Why terrorize a child?" Silas's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. Mr. Pembroke became a liability, a weak link. He developed a late-stage conscience. Bad for business, truly terrible. And that book, Miss Boyd? That ledger is the absolute cornerstone of Mr. Vane's empire. It holds the quantifiable proof that Vanguard Textiles illegally saved $200 million over a decade by poisoning the Sector 4 groundwater, rather than paying for ethical disposal. Silas offered a chilling, thin smile. "It's merely business, Suddy. Your father lacked that necessary understanding, too. He threatened to go to the EPA. Consequently, we were forced to arrange his workplace accident." Tears of pure, blinding rage stung Suddy's vision. The admission was raw, undeniable. "Who is we?" Suddy pushed, leaning into the danger. "Are you saying Charles Vane directly ordered the murder of my father?" Before Silas could even formulate a smug reply, a new voice, smooth and utterly commanding, drifted from the darkness behind the construction light. "Yes, Suddy, I did." Charles Vane materialized into the unforgiving white light. He was dressed impeccably, his silver hair neatly coiffed, looking every inch the philanthropic titan of industry. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a kindly, respected grandfather. He strolled leisurely toward Leo and rested one manicured hand, almost gently, on the shaking boy's shoulder. Leo flinched violently, shrinking from the contact. "A genuine tragedy, truly," Vane said, his tone annoyingly placid as he looked at Suddy. Thomas was a capable foreman, but he possessed a dangerous lack of vision. He simply couldn't comprehend the larger, more profitable picture. Pembroke suffered the same failing. Vane extended his hand, palm up, radiating absolute control. "The ledger, Suddy. It ends here. You lost." Suddy looked at her terrified brother, then at the serene face of the billionaire. She knew, with terrifying certainty, that Thorn had been right. They were never going to walk out. Vane was here because he needed to witness the final extermination personally. Slowly, the very embodiment of defeat, Suddy walked forward and placed the heavy leather satchel into Vane's waiting hand. Vane opened it immediately. He extracted the black book and delicately leafed through the pages, verifying the distinctive handwriting, the dense chemical tables, the names on the bribery payroll. He nodded, profoundly satisfied. He tucked the book securely under his arm. Excellent, Vane stated. He turned to Silas, his voice emotionless. Clean up this inevitable mess. Make it look like a tragic, domestic drug deal that spiraled out of control. Then torch the building to the ground. Silas raised the silenced pistol, its barrel now aiming squarely at Suddy's sternum. No! Leo screamed, a muffled, desperate sound against his gag. Suddy stood perfectly still, staring hard at Vane. You promised me. I lied, Vane replied coldly, already turning his back to walk away. Goodbye, Suddy. Silas tightened his grip on the trigger. In that fraction of a second, Suddy's hand flew into the pocket of her worn jacket. She didn't produce a weapon. She produced the small, cheap burner phone Thorne had given her, jamming her thumb down violently on speed dial 1. The instant Suddy's thumb depressed the button, the colossal space inside the steel mill erupted into orchestrated, blinding chaos. Jack Thorne hadn't just been hiding in the rafters. He had been meticulously setting the stage. From the dense darkness nearly 40 feet above the floor, a blinding white light blossomed. A rigged magnesium flare, affixed to a counterweight, hissed with the fury of a collapsing star as it plummeted directly toward the circle of light where Silas stood guard. What the? Silas roared, flinching and shielding his eyes as the flare crashed into the concrete floor mere yards away, instantly showering the area in blinding, explosive sparks. Simultaneously, a horrific, deafening clang ripped through the hangar. Thorne had cut the brake on an ancient, dormant overhead gantry crane. A massive, rusted steel hook, the size of a small car, swung down from the gloom like a brutal pendulum of judgment. It missed Vane's head by inches, the sheer wind of its passage whipping his expensive hair into his eyes, before smashing into the crate holding the construction light. The lamp exploded in a shower of glass and electricity. The mill plunged into near-total, suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the harsh, strobing white glare of the burning magnesium flare struggling on the floor. Secure the boy, Vane shrieked, clutching the ledger like a life raft and stumbling frantically backward into the deepest shadows. Silas, temporarily blinded by the magnesium flash and profoundly disoriented by the noise, emptied his weapon wildly. Phut, phut. 2 muffled bullets struck and sparked off the machinery just inches from Suddy's ear. Suddy did not freeze. The violent adrenaline cocktail pumping through her veins was pure, undiluted survival instinct. She dropped instantly to her knees, sliding across the slick concrete toward Leo's chair. Don't move, Leo, she yelled over the cacophony. She reached her brother, whose eyes were squeezed tight, his body shaking uncontrollably. Suddy fumbled in her pocket for the small, flimsy pocket knife she used to slice open boxes at the diner. A meager tool but razor-sharp. She sawed frantically at the heavy ropes binding his thin wrists. Over there. I see the muzzle flash. Silas roared, having shaken off the disorientation. He leveled his high-powered weapon toward the elevated shadows where Thorne was positioned. Bang! Silas didn't bother with the silencer now. He was firing for a clean kill. Up on the rusting catwalk, Thorne swore under his breath. He scrambled along the grating, the heavy camera still clutched firmly. He wasn't a soldier. He was a soft journalist with bad knees and a beer gut. But he had the one weapon Vane feared. Undeniable, documented truth. And the camera was still rolling. Hey! Down here, you suit-wearing psychopath! Suddy screamed, needing desperately to draw the fire away from Thorne and her brother. She snatched a heavy, oil-caked iron wrench from the detritus left by mill workers years ago and hurled it into the darkness toward the echo of Silas's voice. It clattered loudly against a metal support pillar. Silas pivoted violently, firing 2 shots wildly at the sound. Run, Leo. Get to the exit. Do not stop. Suddy sliced the final binding rope. I'm not leaving you, Leo cried, his voice breaking from fear and relief. Go! Suddy shoved him hard toward the sliver of precious moonlight marking the main doors. Leo stumbled, then turned and sprinted, his sneakers slapping urgently against the wet concrete. Silas heard the boy's rapid footsteps. He spun his gun toward the sound, his movements cold, lethal, and calculated. He would not permit the leverage to escape. Suddy watched the black barrel of the gun track her brother's escape path. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds. She launched herself sideways, tackling Silas just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, ricocheting harmlessly off a nearby girder. They crashed heavily to the floor in a desperate tangle of limbs. Silas was bigger, stronger, and trained for violence, but Suddy was fighting with the terrifying ferocity of a trapped, cornered animal. She clawed for his eyes, bit his gloved hand, and kicked viciously at his shins. "Get off me, you street trash!" Silas grunted, slamming a vicious elbow into Suddy's ribs. She gasped, the air violently evacuating her lungs, but she refused to release her death grip on his gun arm. She slammed his wrist against the unforgiving concrete floor. Once, twice, the pistol skittered away, lost in the impenetrable darkness. Silas roared, a primal sound of frustration, and backhanded her across the face with devastating force. The blow sent Suddy spinning away. She tasted the coppery tang of blood and her vision swam nauseatingly. Silas scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, meticulously straightening the folds of his expensive jacket. He searched for the gun, then fixed his gaze on Suddy, who was struggling painfully to push herself upright. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a long, wicked switchblade. "No more games, bitch!" he hissed, stepping toward her for the final cut. Suddenly, a heavy, jarring thud shook the platform above. A figure dropped from the lowermost gantry rail, landing hard and awkwardly on a discarded pile of dirty sandbags 10 feet away. It was Thorne. He had risked the jump. He let out a suppressed groan, immediately clutching his badly twisted ankle, but he simultaneously ripped a flare gun from his utility belt, the essential second purchase from the hardware store. "Smile for the camera, you son of a bitch," Thorne gritted out, aiming. He pulled the trigger. The flare slammed into Silas's chest, point blank. It didn't pierce the skin, but the sheer force of the impact staggered him backward, and the burning phosphorus instantly ignited his costly raincoat. Silas emitted a terrifying, strangled scream, batting desperately at the rapidly spreading flames, falling backward over the industrial debris. "Suddy, move!" Thorne yelled, limping painfully toward her. He grabbed her arm, hauling her roughly upward. Vane took the service exit. "He still has the book. What about Leo?" Suddy gasped, tightly clutching her bruised ribs. "He made it. I saw him clear the main doors. We have to stop Vane. If he burns that ledger, everything is meaningless." Suddy wiped the slick blood from her split lip. The sharp, agonizing pain in her ribs was instantly eclipsed by a hotter, blinding rage. "Let's go." They ran through the wreckage of the mill, guided by the flickering, dangerous light of Silas's self-immolation behind them. They burst through the rear heavy metal doors into the cool, relentless drizzle of the night. 50 yards away, near the muddy riverbank, Charles Vane was desperately struggling to climb a slippery embankment toward his waiting, black SUV. His suit was already caked in foul mud, and he clutched the leather satchel against his chest like a priceless, irreplaceable lifeline. "Vane!" Suddy shrieked. Vane spun around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He saw Suddy and Thorne pursuing him. He scrambled the last few feet up the hill, reaching his vehicle. He fumbled with the keys, dropping them into the greasy mud, snatching them up again. He ripped the door open and hurled the satchel onto the passenger seat. He dove in, slamming the door shut. The powerful engine roared to life. "He's going to escape," Suddy cried, sprinting harder, ignoring the fiery pain lancing through her chest. Vane revved the engine, but instead of reversing, he floored it forward, intent on running them down before speeding onto the road. The high beams instantly blinded Suddy. She froze mid-stride. "Look out!" Thorn violently shoved her into the adjacent ditch just as the black SUV roared past, missing them by mere feet. Filthy river mud splattered all over them. Vane fishtailed dangerously onto the gravel service road, accelerating toward the highway entrance. He had the book. He had his freedom. He had survived. Suddy lay sprawled in the cold mud, watching the fading red taillights. Defeat crashed over her like a physical weight. "We lost," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain. "He has the proof. He'll incinerate it the instant he reaches home." Thorn pulled himself up in the slime-filled ditch, wiping the grit and cold water from his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his dirty jacket and pulled out his battered smartphone. The screen was badly cracked, but it was aggressively glowing. He began to laugh, a ragged, wheezing, distinctly painful sound of pure triumph. "What?" Suddy looked at him as if he had finally lost his mind. "Why are you laughing, Jack?" He got away. Thorn slowly turned the phone screen toward her. It displayed a familiar social media streaming interface. The view count was ticking upward so rapidly it was a blur. 15,402 watching now. "The camera I had perched in the rafters," Thorn said, a wide, bloody grin spreading across his face. "It wasn't recording to a memory card, Suddy. It was broadcasting via high-speed 5G directly to my old blog server and simultaneously mirroring the feed across 3 major streaming platforms." He tapped the screen, pointing at the scrolling timeline. Vane's complete confession. Silas attempting to execute a child. Vane admitting he ordered your father's murder, all in high-definition audio. Thorn sighed, a deep, satisfied sound. "It's all securely stored in the cloud. Suddy, the entire world just watched Charles Vane confess to capital murder in real time." Suddy stared dumbly at the small screen. The incoming comments were scrolling too fast to read, an overwhelming digital waterfall. "OMG, is this truly happening? Call the FBI immediately. That's Charles Vane. Did he just admit to killing Thomas Boyd?" "He can burn that ledger," Thorn said, leaning back into the mud with an exhausted, final sigh of victory. "But he cannot, for the life of him, burn the internet." The fallout was not merely swift. It was a devastating, seismic event that tore the city's corrupt foundation wide open. Because Jack Thorne's impromptu livestream had achieved instant, unprecedented viral status within seconds of Vane's final, damning words, Charles Vane never made it back to the sanctuary of his gilded mansion. He didn't even reach the privacy of his personal airfield. A state trooper, alerted by an urgent dispatch detailing a suspect wanted for armed kidnapping and capital murder, spotted the mud-caked luxury SUV tearing recklessly down the interstate. The ensuing chase was brief but instantly televised. News helicopters, having scrambled the moment Thorne's feed started trending globally on Twitter and Reddit, caught the arrest in unforgiving high definition. The indelible image of Charles Vane, the billionaire philanthropist and supposedly untouchable titan of industry, being violently dragged out of his vehicle. His face pressed into the wet asphalt, handcuffs clicking shut while he screamed incoherently about his constitutional rights and his team of lawyers, instantly became the defining, humiliating image of the decade. Inside the passenger compartment of the SUV, police found the leather satchel. It was muddy, battered, and torn, but its critical contents were pristine. They found the ledger. They found the detailed payroll list of bribed officials. They found the undeniable proof that Vanguard Textiles had systemically poisoned a generation of citizens simply to cut disposal costs. By sunrise, the city mayor had announced an emergency federal investigation. By noon, the police captain, whose name was scrawled on page 45 of the ledger, had tearfully turned in his badge and gun, accepting a plea deal before the ink was even dry on his formal resignation. By dinner time, the stock in Vanguard Textiles had plummeted so violently that trading had to be officially suspended on the New York Stock Exchange. Suddy didn't witness any of this immediate maelstrom. She was resting in a quiet, climate-controlled room at St. Jude's Hospital, the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor the only sound replacing the brutal, echoing roar of the steel mill. Her ribs were tightly taped, each shallow breath a sharp, painful reminder of the savage struggle, and her face was heavily bruised, but she felt a profound lightness she hadn't experienced in 6 years. She sat patiently in a chair next to the bed where Leo slept soundly. He was under a heavy sedative to help his young mind process the sudden trauma, but he was physically safe. His chest rose and fell in a perfectly peaceful rhythm. Suddy held his small hand, her thumb gently tracing his knuckles, grounding herself in the sweet reality that they were both, miraculously, alive. The door creaked open, and a gentle nurse peeked in. "There's someone here to see you, honey. He says he's the truth." Suddy managed a strained smile, a painful tug at her split lip. "Send him in." Jack Thorne hobbled into the room on aluminum crutches, his left ankle immobilized in a thick white bandage. He looked awful, unshaven, covered in bruises and dried mud stains, wearing a thin hospital gown over his jeans. But his eyes were electric, brilliantly alive. He was no longer the defeated drunk she had found in that squalid apartment. He was a man resurrected, a warrior returned. "You look like you tried to go 12 rounds with a speeding freight train," Suddy whispered. Thorne grinned painfully, carefully easing himself into the spare chair. "You should see the other guys." Thorne pulled out his phone again, the cracked screen still glowing. "You have absolutely no idea, Suddy. The world is on fire. Vane is secured. Silas is currently listed in critical condition under heavy police guard. And my old editor at the Tribune, the one who publicly fired me, has left 14 consecutive voicemails begging me to come back as editor-in-chief." He showed her the screen. The triumphant headlines were everywhere, plastered across every major news site. "Justice for Sector 4. Waitress and journalist expose billionaire poison ring." "We did it," Suddy said, the magnitude of the reality finally sinking deep into her bones. "It's actually finished." "Not just finished," Thorne corrected, leaning forward, the fire in his eyes undimmed. "It's a terrifying new beginning. But listen, someone else is here to see you. Someone who sounds decidedly fancy." Days later, the heavy humidity had broken, and the dust of the massive confrontation had begun to settle across the city. The atmosphere, however, had undergone a seismic shift. The relentless, oppressive rain had finally given way, replaced by a crisp, almost impossibly clear autumn sun that struck the still wet pavement, causing it to glitter like scattered diamonds. Felt like a cleansing. Suddy walked out through the automatic doors of the hospital entrance, her fingers laced tightly with Leo's. He was subdued, still slightly pale and clearly shaken by the chaotic events of the previous nights, but the faint, natural color had returned to his cheeks, and his step was steady. He was going to be all right. A black sedan, discreet and polished, was waiting at the curb. It was a sleek, diplomatic Lincoln Town car, a stark contrast to the menacing, blacked-out SUVs Vane's men had favored. This vehicle radiated quiet authority, not violence. A uniformed chauffeur stood sentinel by the rear door, but it was the woman stepping out from the back seat who immediately commanded Suddy's attention. She was impeccably tailored, perhaps in her mid-50s, wearing a razor-sharp navy business suit that seemed expensive and necessary. She radiated an air of calm, unshakable competence. A person who managed empires, not just schedules. "Miss Boyd?" the woman asked, her voice modulated and precise. Suddy tensed instinctively, the motion automatic. She pulled Leo slightly behind her, her body angling defensively. Old habits, the necessity of eternal vigilance, died excruciatingly hard. "Who are you?" "My name is Eleanor Vance," the woman stated, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable core of authority. "I am the executive of Austin Pembroke's estate." Suddy relaxed her shoulders slightly, though her internal guard remained fully operational. "Mr. Pembroke is dead. I saw the news." "Yes," Eleanor said, a fleeting shadow of genuine, unperformative grief crossing her face. "But Austin was a man who planned for every eventuality, Miss Boyd, including his own untimely exit. He amended his will and final instructions only 3 days ago. He left specific, highly detailed orders that should his death be ruled unnatural, and should the contents of a certain black ledger come to light, I was to find you immediately. She opened the back door of the car, the leather interior smelling faintly of expensive wood and newness. Please, there is somewhere we need to go. It won't take long. Suddy hesitated, weighing the risk. She looked down at Leo, then across the street to Thorne, who was leaning against a weathered stone hospital wall, talking quietly into his phone, waiting for his own ride. Thorne glanced up, caught her eye, and nodded a small, encouraging motion. Go ahead, kid. I'll be fine. I have a press conference to crash, and a deadline that won't wait. Suddy returned her gaze to Eleanor Vance. Okay. They drove in silence through the revitalized city center. The car was a vault of quiet, perfectly insulated from the aggressive snarl of downtown traffic. They stopped in front of the Pembroke Industries headquarters, a towering, impossibly high glass skyscraper that was a monolith of steel and glass, reaching up into the pale autumn clouds. It looked like the peak of power. They bypassed the public lobbies and took a private, express elevator straight to the penthouse office suite. It was a vast, open space, severe and elegant, lined with deep mahogany paneling and structured by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view. The space felt desperately lonely now, a silent, immaculate monument to a man who had spent his life building an empire, only to try and dismantle its darkest, most compromised parts in his final hours. Mr. Pembroke had no family, Eleanor explained, walking over to a massive, imposing oak desk that looked out over the entire sprawling cityscape. He spent his life acquiring wealth, often by looking the other way when men like Charles Vane cut corners and corrupted institutions. He regretted that deeply in his final months. He knew he was dying of cancer, even before Vane had him killed. He wanted to clear his ledger. She picked up a thick, cream-colored envelope from the desk blotter, its edges crisp and official, and handed it across the immense expanse of oak to Suddy. He set up a blind trust, Eleanor continued, keeping her gaze steady. It is funded entirely by the immediate liquidation of his personal assets and the sale of non-critical holdings. The primary goal of the trust is the complete environmental restoration of Sector 4 and full, comprehensive medical compensation for every single family affected by the Vanguard dumping. Suddy's breath hitched in her throat, the magnitude of the statement staggering her. Everyone? Everyone, including retroactive, restorative payments for those who have passed due to the poisoning. Eleanor paused, her eyes softening with a genuine kindness that cut through her corporate armor. But there is a separate stipulation and a private bequest for you. Suddy opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of dense, complex legal documents, but resting neatly on top was a cashier's check. She focused on the numbers, trying to process the sheer quantity of zeros. The number was staggering, paralyzing. This wasn't just get by money. It was never worry again, ever money. It was enough to buy Jerry's diner 10 times over and still have sufficient capital to be comfortable. It was enough to buy a proper house with a huge, fenced yard for Leo. It was enough to secure her future and breathe free for the rest of her life. Suddy stared at the check, her hands beginning to tremble slightly, a mixture of shock and incomprehensible gratitude washing over her. Why? She whispered, looking up at Eleanor, her eyes swimming with sudden tears. I don't understand. I was just a waitress to him. He came in, ate a steak and left me a $2 tip. He insulted me. He didn't insult you, Suddy. He tested you, Eleanor said gently, walking toward the immense window. Eleanor looked out at the sprawling, indifferent city below, hazy in the autumn light. Austin told me every detail about that night. He said he saw Thomas in your eyes. He saw the same moral fire, the same unwavering honesty. He knew that if he had simply left you a check for $5,000, you would have been grateful. You would have paid your rent, bought groceries, and quietly gone back to work, safe, but crucially, you would have stayed silent. Eleanor turned back, her expression intensely serious. He needed you angry. He knew that gratitude makes people complacent, but righteous anger makes people fight. He needed someone with the visceral fire to finish what he was too afraid, or too sick, to start himself. He bet his entire legacy that the specific, pointed insult of a $2 tip would push you just far enough to look under the plate and expose the truth. Suddy looked down at the check in her hand, then back up at the majestic, cruel city visible through the glass. She thought about the incandescent rage she had felt that night, the furious injustice that had driven her out of the diner and into the investigation. He was right. That specific rage had fueled her through the rain, through the crippling fear, and through the fiery crucible of the steel mill. He bet everything on you, Suddy, Eleanor affirmed. And he won. Suddy slowly walked to the window, joining Eleanor. From this dizzying height, the city looked strangely peaceful, disconnected from the violence below. Far in the distance, she could clearly see the distinctive profile of the steel mill's smokestacks, now silent and officially cordoned off as a massive crime scene. She could see the grid of streets in Sector 4, the neighborhood where her father had lived and died, trying to do the right thing against insurmountable odds. She reached up and touched the cheap, tarnished silver locket around her neck, the one she never took off. "We got him, Dad," she whispered, her voice choking with emotion, the tears finally flowing freely. "We really got him. They can't hurt anyone else." Leo walked up beside her, quietly slipping his small, warm hand into hers. He looked at the vast, intimidating view, then up at his sister's tear-streaked but radiant face. "Sadie, does this mean we don't have to be scared anymore?" Suddy squeezed his hand, holding him tightly. She thought about the black ledger now secure. She thought about Jack Thorne, who was probably already outlining the Pulitzer-winning book that would solidify his legacy. And she thought about the 2 crumpled dollar bills she still instinctively kept folded in her pocket, the profound insult that had ultimately saved their lives. She turned to her little brother. For the first time in 6 agonizing years, the crushing weight of responsibility and terror was gone from her shoulders. The smile on her face wasn't the forced, practiced, polite smile of a waitress trying to make rent. It was the radiant, terrifyingly beautiful smile of a woman who had willingly walked through hell and emerged completely, gloriously whole on the other side. "No, Leo," she said softly, the affirmation solid and absolute. "We never have to be scared again. So what do we do now?" Leo asked, his voice full of hope and curiosity. Suddy looked at the check, then back out at the city that now felt like a place of possibility, not danger. She knew exactly what she was going to do. She wasn't just going to survive in the ashes of the old life. She was going to build something entirely new. Now, Suddy laughed, the sound bright and free, a sound Leo hadn't heard in years. "Now we go get the biggest steak in the city, and we leave the waitress a massive, life-changing tip." Suddy Boyd went from desperately counting quarters to being the reluctant instrument that brought down an industrial empire. All because one dying man understood that sometimes a spark of righteous anger is infinitely more valuable than a pot of gold. Austin Pembroke didn't just leave a tip. He left a mission. Charles Vane is currently serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Jack Thorne won the Pulitzer Prize for his exhaustive, fearless coverage of the Vanguard scandal. And Suddy? She bought Jerry's Diner. She renamed it Thomas's Place, dedicating it to the father who had started the fight years ago. And if you go there today, look right above the cash register. Framed meticulously in glass, you'll see 2 crumpled $1 bills, a constant, sharp reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover, and you should never, ever underestimate a waitress. What an incredible journey of courage, loss, and ultimate victory. It just goes to show that justice can come from the most unlikely places, delivered by the most unexpected heroes. If you enjoyed this story of mystery, resilience, and the ultimate revenge, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story of true grit. Share this video with a friend who needs a win today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.